Tucker Carlson hosts the most popular cable news show on television. His most recent ratings show he averaged 3.2 million viewers a night on Fox News with his Tucker Carlson Tonight program. It debuted on November 14, 2016, originally at 7 p.m., but following the cancellation of The O'Reilly Factor, Tucker inherited the 8 p.m. time slot in 2017. The show grew in popularity, topping out at 4.33 million viewers in the second quarter of 2020, the most viewers ever for a cable news program in the United States. The show proved so popular that Fox News expanded its relationship with Tucker Carlson in the spring of 2021 by giving him a morning show, Tucker Carlson Today, that airs 3 times a week, and Tucker Carlson Originals, which airs once a month, both of these appearing on the Fox Nation streaming platform. If you're not familiar with who Tucker Carlson is, a very brief recap is that he lived a middle-class life as a child until his father married into the wealthy Swanson family, whose fortune come from those frozen TV dinners. His privileged life led him to a career in journalism, where he wrote for a few conservative outlets. In 2000, he worked at CNN on a show called Crossfire. This show ended when he was embarrassed by Jon Stewart on camera, and Carlson did not renew his CNN contract. He then spent some time at PBS, had a show on MSNBC for a few years, before finally finding a home at Fox News in 2009, where he was eventually given his own show in 2017. If you want more details about the history of Tucker Carlson, I highly recommend this recap of his life from Some More News. With all this Tucker Carlson content on offer, I decided to consume a whole week's worth of his stuff to get an idea of what it's like to be in the Tucker Carlson audience, and what it feels like to get the full effect of his work. This is for the week of October 18th, 2021.
Now, off to the Garden of Madness.
The first part of every episode of Tucker Carlson Tonight is the feature story, typically ranging from 15 to 20 minutes. It makes up half of each episode and is usually the part that has everyone buzzing the next day. These feature stories are largely centered around a monologue where Carlson builds his case, and they're capped off with a brief interview. The October 18th edition of the show offers a great example. It began with the recent passing of former United States Secretary of State Colin Powell.
Unlike other people in Washington, Colin Powell got where he was on merit, and that was inspiring to watch.
And eventually it turned into a rant about how Americans are living in a medical apartheid state.
We have a division, medical apartheid. We have rules, but some people have exempted themselves from the rules, and they're not ashamed of it.
Here's how he made the jump. The crucial step in drawing a connection between Powell's death and this authoritarian nightmare is that Powell died of complications related to COVID-19, even though he had been vaccinated. Once this connection is made, 2 minutes into this 14-minute segment, it stops being about Powell entirely.
Like almost everyone his age, Colin Powell was fully vaccinated against COVID. And yet, according to his family and doctors, Colin Powell died of COVID. Of course, that fact does not make his death any less sad, nor is it unusual. Many thousands of vaccinated Americans have died of COVID. Former CDC Director Robert Redfield announced just today that about 40% of all recent COVID deaths in the state of Maryland, for example, are among those who have had both shots.
This is a deeply deceptive stat. Looking at Maryland alone, the 8th most vaccinated state, with, at the time of writing, 65.8% of its population being fully vaccinated. This would mean that breakthrough cases, that is, cases of vaccinated people suffering from COVID, would be more common because such a large percentage of the state is fully vaccinated.
The State Department of Health agrees, writing in a statement, as the number of our residents who are vaccinated continues to increase, we expect to see an increase in the proportion of COVID-related deaths occurring in vaccinated individuals. Many of these deaths are linked to comorbidities that make patients more vulnerable.
Even on its face, though, if most people are fully vaccinated and the majority of deaths are still attributed to the unvaccinated, it seems like getting a vaccine is a good idea. A wide review of the numbers available from the CDC reveals that COVID deaths are dramatically more common among the unvaccinated, with the unvaccinated being 11 times more likely to die of COVID than the vaccinated. Powell's death is an anecdote, a high-profile case of something that isn't terribly common. It's being used to push a narrative about skepticism towards the vaccine. It's all a pretense to get to the real message of the segment.
Well, it tells you you've been lied to. Vaccines may be highly useful for some people, but across a population, they do not solve COVID.
The language here is crucial. What does solve COVID even mean? That a vaccine will completely eliminate it? Vaccines rarely eradicate illnesses, with the only transmissible one among humans that has been wiped out so far being smallpox. The vague usage of solve and how it will never be achieved is how Carlson can imply that the vaccine really isn't worth getting, at least for most people, without outright denying it has any significant effect at all. His earlier statement implies that it's a very narrow effect.
Vaccines may be highly useful for some people,
The COVID vaccine has been demonstrated to dramatically reduce one's chance of death, but the number of deaths aren't the only talking point Carlson uses. Carlson also says the vaccine doesn't effectively slow the spread of COVID. This also isn't true. Craig Spencer, an emergency medicine physician and director of global health and emergency medicine at New York Presbyterian Columbia University Medical Center, writing for The Atlantic, said, "To spread the coronavirus, you have to have the coronavirus. And vaccinated people are far less likely to have the coronavirus, period." Even in instances of breakthrough cases where a vaccinated person is infected with the Delta variant of COVID, preliminary data shows that transmission is reduced by 63%, albeit for a period of a few months. For the Alpha variant of COVID, transmission is even more greatly reduced by a vaccine, increasing to 73%. A lot of this data is still being peer-reviewed, but so far the majority of the science seems to be saying the exact opposite of what Tucker Carlson is asserting. But he doesn't say any of it in an attempt to accurately discuss the science of the day. It's all a guise to get to what he really wants to talk about. President Biden is demanding obedience, and people are fearfully obeying him.
They're afraid of you. They can't explain why they're afraid of you. The president told them that you are dangerous, and so they're afraid. The question is, over time, what does that do to your most cherished relationships, to your friendship, to your family relationships? What does it do to the country?
The Biden administration is, apparently, using the pandemic to destroy American families, or as Tucker would put it,
America has once again become what it was when Colin Powell got his commission in the Army. America has become segregated, not between black and white, but between vaccinated and unvaccinated.
This is how Tucker creates the illusion of a coherent narrative. Colin Powell being alive during segregation is purely incidental, and segregation itself was a deliberate attempt to restrict black people from positions of power and influence within American society because of the color of their skin, which is hardly the same as not letting someone who is far more likely to carry an infectious disease eat at an Applebee's. But what makes Tucker Carlson particularly effective is that he isn't just spreading partisan talking points. His monologues also include a healthy dose of conspiracy theories.
This is a pandemic of the Chinese government, born in a lab in Wuhan and brought here, either accidentally or not. That's the fact of it.
This is also not a fact. The current state of the debate, according to an article in The New Yorker, is that there is no conclusive evidence to support that claim, and most scientists who study viruses are inclined to say it was a naturally occurring virus. The most plausible version of this theory is that it was being studied at this lab and was accidentally leaked because of a lack of safety precautions, not that it was created by the Chinese government. The rant continues like this for nearly 10 minutes. It's a fire hose of misinformation. And by 10 minutes in, it's spiraling into madness as a few seconds of video of Joe Biden not wearing a mask at a restaurant is used as evidence of him declaring himself some kind of grand ruler, as only servants wear masks.
But he didn't wear a mask. Why? Because masks are for servants. And he's the president. He's not a servant.
The official explanation here is that Biden was eating at a restaurant and was in the process of putting his mask back on, having taken it off to eat his food. Something that I am inclined to believe since you can clearly see him holding the mask as he walks. The video was widely circulated on right-wing media as Biden flaunting the rules, but Tucker Carlson takes it even further, saying Biden meant to be filmed to send a message to Americans, a message that, ironically, never would have been heard had not right-wing media figures, like himself, obsessed over it. This clip itself is not a story, but it does offer a wonderful example of how right-wing media takes innocuous footage to concoct a narrative. Biden being slow to put his mask on is now him telling America that he is their God King. And wasn't this whole segment about Colin Powell's death? And now we're talking about how Joe Biden being filmed in a restaurant not wearing a mask for a few seconds means he's crowning himself the Emperor of America? It's almost as if this whole monologue was written independent of Powell's death, and then that part was inserted later to make the narrative seem newsworthy. And one last detail about Colin Powell Carson did eventually share with us also seemed important.
So at the beginning of the show, we told you about Colin Powell. We left out that Colin Powell was suffering from a number of different health problems. But of course, that's the point. The point of vaccinating the vulnerable is so people with other underlying health problems won't die of COVID. But unfortunately, that didn't work in the case of General Powell, and it didn't work for many thousands of other Americans. And of course, that's the point we're making in the first place.
Colin Powell was suffering from multiple myeloma, which compromised his immune system, making the vaccine less effective. An important detail if you're trying to claim that the vaccine itself isn't effective, a detail that completely undermines his entire rant, which is why it happens more than 25 minutes after the segment is over, just as the show is going off the air. Because this rant was a con, and Tucker Carlson knows it. But that monologue was, believe it or not, the strongest and most convincing one I saw that week. I want to talk about two other ones that show us how things can get really crazy on this show. On October 20th, Tucker Carlson started his show with a segment that had an impressive number of jumps. We started with a statement about how America was changed by the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020.
This really was the pivot point. It was the height of the BLM riots early last summer.
Which turns into a story of how the media lies to people.
MSNBC's explicit editorial policy to lie about what you were watching live, to characterize violent riots as peaceful protests.
And then this moves to a discussion about looting.
The country your ancestors built is on fire, but shut up because your ancestors also burned it down.
Which pivots to an article about supply chain issues in the US.
The Washington Post just ran this headline, and we're quoting, "Don't rant about short-staffed stores and supply chain woes."
And apparently America is now falling apart.
Don't complain as your life becomes worse and as your country degrades.
This leads to a point about store closures.
You notice the Walgreens is, for example, closed, and so is the CVS, because everything in there has been stolen by thieves who have now been redefined as civil rights protesters. Stop complaining, Karen.
And suddenly we're talking about cities being overrun with drug addicts.
Oh, wait a second. There are junkies living in tents right across from your kid's school. Well, they've always been there too. They were there when you were a kid, you just never noticed. Just readjust your expectations. Settle down, Karen.
And there are undocumented immigrant rapists on trains.
Philadelphia last week, several people on a train, they got on the train and then they got to watch as a man raped a woman on the train for minutes.
And Biden's border policy is destroying America.
You want more of this? We may be getting it. Today, Joe Biden's nominee to lead the Border Patrol, a guy called Chris Magnus, sat for his confirmation hearings. Now, it turns out that Magnus, if anything, is to the left of Biden, even to the left of Barack Obama on immigration matters.
Did you follow all that? Black Lives Matter is somehow connected to Joe Biden destroying America with immigrants. Or the impression Carlson's audience more likely got that America is being destroyed, and it's Biden's fault. The hows and whys aren't important. The segment isn't designed to be coherent. It's designed to create a vague feeling of fear about the state of America and to direct that fear and possibly anger towards Joe Biden. The segment itself is, of course, filled with misinformation. Take the op-ed from the Washington Post, which Tucker claims is an attack on Americans, telling them to lower their expectations, as if they need to be ready for some kind of socialist hellscape.
Lower your expectations. What did you expect in America? Come on. Bread lines. We've always had bread lines. It's sort of charmingly retro, these bread lines.
If we read beyond the headline, what the article by Micheline Maynard actually says is, rather than living constantly on the verge of throwing a fit and risking taking it out on overwhelmed servers, struggling shop owners, or late arriving delivery people, we do ourselves a favor by consciously lowering expectations. Rather than being an attack on Americans, it's a simple plea for Americans not to take their frustrations out on workers who have no control over supply chain issues. Carlson also claims that Walgreens stores in San Francisco are closing because of organized shoplifting.
San Francisco has very few Walgreens or CVS's or stores like that left because they've all been looted by civil rights protesters.
This is contradicted by numbers from the police, which do not support this wave of shoplifting at Walgreens, a narrative common on social media based on a handful of cell phone videos. Walgreens has not only refused to share internal data related to shoplifting with reporters in San Francisco, their parent company, Walgreens Boots Alliance, was forecasting between 150 and 400 store closures by 2024. Since 2016, Walgreens has closed 22 stores in San Francisco, and those numbers include the recent story Tucker is responding to, in which Walgreens had announced it was closing 5 stores.
Now, San Francisco has very few Walgreens or CVS's or stores like that left because they've all been looted.
It still has 53 stores operating in San Francisco, a far cry from what Tucker claims. Also not mentioned in this segment is that, in New York City, Walgreens is shutting down 16 stores. I suspect it might have made it into the segment had they found cell phone footage of a black person stealing something, though. Which, by the way, is used to justify the earlier mention of Black Lives Matter, which was about making shoplifting legal, according to Tucker Carlson. It's also interesting to see how Tucker Carlson, who many describe as a populist, parroting the talking points of a corporation like Walgreens, which happily spreads the organized shoplifting talking point to disguise the fact that it had been planning to close stores regardless of this supposed wave of shoplifting. Perhaps Tucker is happily towing this corporate line because it at least lets him demonize black communities. It's the jumps that really make this segment more than misinformation, though. The narrative through line of America's decay is barely held together as Tucker jumps from one sensationalized story to another, and he uses folksy little turns of phrase or hurls out the carrot insult to engage his audience emotionally. This isn't designed to get people thinking about the news of the day. It's designed to rally their emotions against the left. Tucker Carlson's opening stories are so narrative-focused that sometimes he doesn't even need to misrepresent actual news stories. In some cases, he just presents something made up entirely out of nothing. That is so obviously true in the October 21st show. This segment opens with some truly shocking footage released by the Biden administration. Before moving on, I want everyone to take a moment and think about what this video says. And you don't need any deep analysis here. Just think about the events you saw unfold and what they were about. Really ask yourself, does anything seem amiss here? Does this footage reveal some hidden truth? Okay, here's what Tucker thought when he watched that video.
It's like a room full of aliens have gathered to act out this concept they've just heard about called happiness. The head alien is a supernaturally strange being called Kamala Harris, who for reasons no one ever explains walks into a room in the most secure building in the world with a piece of elasticized fabric over her face. Like, that's totally normal. Just another masked birthday celebration. Harris suddenly yells surprise at her own surprise birthday party, like she's hosting the event for one of her multiple personalities. What the hell is going on here?
I can answer that question. Harris acted awkwardly during a surprise birthday party, and everyone is wearing masks because of COVID. But Tucker has to pretend this is some bizarre, unthinkable scenario where people are acting in strange and confusing ways that reveal a deep mental rot at the core of the Biden White House. He goes on for several minutes about these videos, making a number of strange points like that no one says gorgeous anymore.
She goes on to use the word gorgeous, a word that no actual human being has used since 1977.
I am completely willing to believe no one calls Tucker gorgeous, but that doesn't mean no one says it.
First of all, is the answer yes?
The answer is absolutely yes, Joe, and I am ready to work. I am ready to do this with you, for you. I'm just deeply honored, and I'm very excited.
Whoa.
Whoa, indeed. Nearly 6 minutes in, and all Tucker is talking about are these social media posts. He's calling them staged, and even if they are, so what? They're pieces of PR designed to make President Biden and Vice President Harris seem more human and relatable. Much like your grandpa, Joe Biden also doesn't know how to turn off a speakerphone. If these moments are staged, the fact that none of these people are actors should explain the awkward delivery. But to Tucker Carlson, there's something far more sinister. More sinister than North Korean military propaganda.
But what's the message of the Joe and Kamala videos? All your nightmares are real? The people in charge are even worse than you thought they were? Kamala may have seemed kind of fake to you. Joe may have looked a little out of it. But actually, the White House is now telling us, you don't know the half of it.
According to Tucker, the White House is trying to tell everyone that these people are losing their mind or are robots. These are presented as basic readings of these videos and not right-wing spin, and that's what makes it so effective. The phrasing demands the audience accept the basic premise just to get to the conspiracy theory. You must believe Joe Biden is senile before getting to the idea that this is a deliberate move by the White House to rub it in everyone's faces. Why they would do this is never really explored. The conspiracy theory is a bonus because the main point here is to reinforce the idea that Joe Biden is senile and that Kamala Harris is some kind of robot. This is 1/3 of the way into this night's commentary, and have you spotted anything newsworthy so far? All we've seen is Tucker Carlson opine about some harmless social media PR posts, but it does get even more intense.
In December of last year, Kamala Harris, who grew up in Canada, a foreign country.
I appreciate the subtle menace Tucker Carlson has when he describes Canada as a foreign country. We usually don't get much credit for how scary we are. Tucker is really shocked at how brazen a lie Harris told was, though.
Swore that she witnessed, quote, multiple generations of her family celebrating Kwanzaa, an American holiday that was invented in Long Beach, California, after Kamala Harris was born. Not one word is true, but not one word is believable. Again, it was a prepared statement. It was carefully considered. They didn't even bother to look at a calendar.
Luckily for us, I did look at a calendar. Kamala Harris was born in 1964 in California. The American celebration of Kwanzaa was first held in 1966. So the idea of Kamala Harris celebrating this with her family, including parents and grandparents, as a child seems pretty reasonable. This is likely what she meant when she said celebrating across generations. As for the Canada part, Harris was born in California and moved to Montreal when she was 12. She moved back to the US at 18 to attend Howard University in Washington, D.C. So is it really hard to imagine that between the ages of 2 and 12, she might have celebrated Kwanzaa with her parents and grandparents? Also, Kwanzaa may have started in the US, but it's celebrated in Canada too. And even if it wasn't, there are no Canadian laws preventing American families from celebrating Kwanzaa in Montreal. The segment is nearly 10 minutes through, and it's completely filled with stuff like this. Tucker Carlson reacting to dopey videos released by the White House. This is the news he thinks is worth commenting on. And to make it seem worthwhile, he needs to make it sound as dramatic and scary as possible. He goes as far as to compare it to a cult.
It's kind of nuts when you think about it. These people literally have no idea how absurd they look. And how could they? They live in a tiny, airless cult where everyone pretends that Joe Biden is fully competent and Kamala Harris is a civil rights hero. It's Jonestown.
And he brings a guest on to tell us that these videos are somehow related to communism.
It's because every part of the system is so corrupt now and rotted with this communist filth.
And that we should think of everyone here as sociopaths.
These people are not capable of that kind of shame. It's not in their nature. They are completely lost. They're sociopaths, all of them.
This is literally all this segment is. I suspect the Jesse Keller interview only went on as long as it did, over 3 minutes, because of how little substance was actually present. I'm genuinely impressed that Tucker Carlson took something as flat and sparse of content, such as PR videos on White House social media, and turned it into a narrative about some kind of Biden cult / Obama's third term.
This is Obama's third term. And these people are picked because they're compliant and hollow.
But this segment, more than all the others, demonstrates what this show does. It takes news stories, or sometimes things that are barely news events, lies about them, and then builds these fantastic narratives of cults and oppression. To oppose the Biden administration isn't to have a political disagreement, it's to be standing against the monstrous sociopaths who want to destroy America. It catastrophizes political reality to such an extreme that the opposition can only be understood as the most dire of threats. And then Tucker will, in the same breath, complain about how the other side is trying to divide us, which is rich coming from someone who uses a video about flowers being delivered to push a narrative about a cult destroying America. While the opening segment is Tucker Carlson's show at its purest, the show does go on for another 20 to 25 minutes after it's over. These are the quick hits, where 5 or 6 different stories are crammed into tiny segments that leave the audience less informed and more afraid. Here's a quick example of a story from the October 18th episode.
In recent weeks, thousands of illegal aliens have been flown from the Texas border into Westchester County Airport in New York on charter jets.
Presented as breaking news is the story of children being flown from the southern U.S. border to New York. He interviews conservative New York Post columnist Miranda Devine for details.
By the government, they were all unaccompanied children, but several of them did look to us to be males in their 20s, late teens.
Some of the language here should raise some alarm. According to the government, the people being brought to New York are all children, but according to Devine, some of them looked older. The photos used on TV make it tough to tell, but if you look at the New York Post article, there are much clearer photos of these people who are obviously children, as they're significantly shorter than the man who is escorting them. Also, when Devine claims that these flights are coming in the dead of night, that isn't what we're seeing in these photos. According to the article, these photos were of flights that arrived at 9:52 p.m. and 10:49 p.m. There is a record of 2 flights landing at 2:13 a.m. and 4:29 a.m. on August 20th, but these are the only examples offered in the article that might be considered the dead of night. It then describes that these children are being sent to family members, and those without family members are going to an organization called Mercy First, which works with the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement to find kids who have been granted refugee status safe homes. These brief few minutes are used to illustrate that the Biden administration is somehow breaking the law, and that it needs to offer greater transparency on where refugee children are being settled because, well, they never really say why. Tucker does mention that some kind of federal law is being violated, but he doesn't say which one. And the only evidence of something nefarious going on is that some of these flights might be past the bedtimes of these children. They can't come out and say what they want their audience to think because that wouldn't be as safe as the dog whistle they're using instead. This is a segment designed to portray refugee children as a danger to America. Tucker Carlson Tonight crams in 5 to 6 of these segments every night in its second half. Much like the opening segment, they're rife with conspiracy theories such as vaccines for military personnel being used to get Christians out of the military.
So by forcing this, you get to find out who sincerely believes in God, and then you know their names at that point, and then you can expel them using the pretext of the COVID vaccine.
UFOs going after American nukes.
UFOs interacted with nuclear weapons platforms and either rendered them inoperable or took them offline.
The content matters less than the general feeling these segments create, to distrust any mainstream narrative, and to believe any story Tucker is telling you, no matter how outlandish. All these different topics, particularly the ones that are highlighted in the second half of the show, are a means to maintain talking points that aren't necessarily the hot topic of the moment, such as critical race theory or affirmative consent on college campuses. The vague general threats of non-white people and feminism is kept alive in the minds of viewers whenever stories like these are referenced. It also gives them the appearance of legitimacy, as if these are ongoing issues that need to be monitored rather than completely fabricated stories that are simply maintained by a dedicated right-wing media, to ensure that the audience doesn't forget that, even though they're not the topic at the moment, sometime in the future, this is a group we might need to scapegoat again. So while the big monologues get a lot of the attention, including in this video, these smaller segments really add up to something truly nefarious. The impression that these right-wing narratives are part of a persistent worldview, one that can be maintained in the minds of viewers through constant attention, not through big tentpole stories. These segments typically include short interviews, often not running for more than 2 or 3 minutes. They make a perfect backdrop for how Tucker Carlson presents stories on his show. Typically, there are 4 reasons why a news program might include an interview. The first is to provide additional information to a story. In his October 21st episode, Tucker Carlson had a short 4-minute segment on a memo issued by Attorney General Merrick Garland directing the FBI to investigate the increasing number of violent threats towards school board members over COVID-related safety requirements, fears over critical race theory, and other culture war narratives popularized on right-wing media. These threats are very real, as there are several videos that can be found of school board meetings being disrupted by crowds of angry parents who use incendiary language, including death threats.
Have you yourself received death threats?
I have.
It's terrifying.
It has an effect on you that you can't really put into words. When someone describes the way they want to come into your home and end your life.
Here's another example of parents upset that their kids might be expected to wear masks at school. The threats have gotten so bad that the National School Boards Association has requested help specifically from the FBI. But this isn't the part of the story Tucker Carlson shares on his show. According to Carlson, the controversy here is that Garland did not disclose that his son-in-law runs a company called Panorama Education, which has a nefarious intent.
Panorama makes a ton of money pushing racist propaganda, the kind that parents are complaining about.
And how does Panorama Education do that? By creating surveys for children that measure their school experience. He brings on Azra Nomani to provide the evidence.
They are asking children from Hawaii to Maine what about their sexuality, their gender, and they're also asking these questions of their parents.
Not being someone who trusts anybody who wears a shirt that says they aren't a domestic terrorist, which is exactly what a domestic terrorist not wanting to be discovered would do, I decided to look into these surveys myself, which are helpfully posted on Panorama Education's website. Although there are multiple surveys, I couldn't find a single one asking kids about their sexuality. There was one question about gender identity, though. It dared to ask a child, "What is your gender?" But other than that, there wasn't anything else on sex and gender that I could see. There were definitely questions about race and culture, though, specifically on pages 28 and 29 out of 56, that asks kids in grades 6 through 12 questions such as, how often do teachers encourage you to learn about people from different races, ethnicities, or cultures? And another one is, how fairly do adults at your school treat people from different races, ethnicities, or cultures? Not exactly what I would call nefarious, and perfectly fitting in a survey that also asks kids, how much support do the adults at your school give you? And how confident are you that you can complete all the work that is assigned in your subject class? Merely asking a question about race is according to Nomani, indoctrinating kids with critical race theory. These types of interviews that add additional information to a story are surprisingly rare, though. Other interviews you might see on Carlson's show are ones that add emotional context, such as when a news event impacts a particular group. Interviewing someone from that group puts a human face on the issue, providing emotional context. We'll have some better examples of that later on, but the closest version of this I saw on Tucker Carlson Tonight was when the show discussed the recent Dave Chappelle Netflix special and the backlash over his comments about the trans community. Tucker Carlson interviewed Seth Dillon of the Babylon Bee, apparently for his response as a comedian. Another type of interview you might see on Tucker Carlson's show is someone with an opposing viewpoint, something that has happened in the past but did not happen on the week I watched, and from what I can gather, doesn't happen all that often on the show in general, particularly after Carlson made the mistake of inviting on Dutch historian Rutger Bregman.
You might not like it, but you're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
But I am talking about these issues.
Yeah, only now. Come on, you jumped the bandwagon. You're all like, oh, I'm against the globalist elite, blah, blah, blah. It's not very convincing, to be honest.
Why don't you go yourself?
Honestly, if I ever get the chance to be speaking to someone like Tucker Carlson, I want it to go down exactly like that. The type of interview that is, by far, the most common on Tucker Carlson Tonight is the supposed expert who comes on to affirm everything Tucker Carlson has been saying, giving it the illusion of authority. Examples of this are, well, more than I can fit in this video. Here's one I enjoyed though. In the October 18th episode, Tucker had a brief segment about an interview with Christopher Steele, whose dossier included a number of accusations toward President Trump. Perhaps most notably the one where there's apparently a tape in Vladimir Putin's possession of women who Trump hired to pee on a bed that Obama had slept in during his trip to Russia. This segment itself is a rehashed complaint about how the investigation into those supposed Russian connections unfairly hamstrung the Trump administration's foreign policy. And to discuss this, Carlson brings on Kash Patel and Devin Nunes. Patel and Nunes add very little of substance in their interview. They vaguely allude to their own personal issues, but the interview lasts less than 3 minutes, giving the men only moments to answer 3 questions between the two of them. Their primary purpose seems to be to agree with Tucker about everything and then deliver zingers like this one.
This guy is no hero. He is no James Bond. He's Inspector Gadget on Sudafed, and now he's crying for the world to love him.
Maybe he can get a job with the Babylon Bee. These interviews are by far the most common ones I saw during the week I watched this show. Figures who show up, nod along with everything Tucker Carlson said, and then make a quick exit, used to cap off a segment as if it now has an authoritative stamp of approval. That's what Tucker Carlson gets from these brief interviews, but I imagine the guests themselves get to expose themselves to Tucker's massive audience and be presented as a friendly face they can trust, because they agree with the same nonsense Tucker Carlson spreads on his show. These are the interviews Tucker Carlson only conducts on his Tucker Carlson Tonight program. There are other sources for people to get their Tucker fix. And in the case of Tucker Carlson Today, it's a long-form interview show that airs on the Fox Nation streaming service. While short segments of these interviews find their way onto Tucker Carlson Tonight, the full 50-plus minute interviews are exclusive to Fox Nation. It's here where Tucker Carlson really digs into the thoughts and opinions of his guests, not like the snippets we see on his Fox News show. And as you might have guessed, Tucker's guests also enjoy agreeing with him. To be fair, these interviews are absolutely in the first category of the ones I outlined above, as these new guests provide lots of new information relative to the narrative being offered. Though ultimately, these discussions support the same kind of narrative Tucker Carlson pushes on his main show, conservative conspiracy theories. Before diving in, I should note that while this show typically airs 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, Tucker Carlson took October 22nd off, so I only have 2 episodes to work with. Though for the sake of my own sanity, that was an hour of Tucker Carlson I was spared. The first of the 2 interviews was with Elbridge Colby, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development at the Department of Defense during the Trump administration. He's a peculiar guest, at least for a friendly interview, considering how much of Tucker Carlson's branding is that he stands up to the elites and insider types of Washington. When the interview starts, Tucker tries to establish that Colby definitely isn't one of those people.
If you scour the foreign policy establishment in Washington, everyone's either implicated in the disasters we're watching now, or there's some kind of crazed neocon ideologue who you would not ask to babysit your children because they're that untrustworthy. So there are very few people whose opinion matters, from our perspective, on this topic, and Elbridge Colby is one of them.
Colby, having some sense of the show he's on, tries to do the same by claiming to have been against the war in Iraq.
But yeah, then I've been working in kind of the national security area for the last 20 years. I entered DC as a very junior guy right around the time of the Iraq fever before the war. And I'd say that kind of set me in one direction because I was not a fan. I mean, my opinion didn't matter at all at that time.
A quick look at Colby's bio revealed that he was part of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq in 2003, which was set up by the Bush administration to help reshape the country, and was also plagued by insider goons from Washington, something extensively written about in the 2006 book Imperial Life in the Emerald City Inside Iraq's Green Zone by Rajiv Chandrasekaran. Being part of the authority that was reshaping Iraq in 2003 is a curious place to be for someone who didn't support the war. After his time in Iraq, Colby continued to work in government for a number of years, and before joining the Trump administration was part of the Center for a New American Security, a think tank that is partially funded by a number of defense contractors and, of course, the US government. He's on Tucker Carlson's show to talk about the looming threat of China and how a military response might be the only option. In short, Colby seems like one of the Washington insiders that Tucker claims to have some deep resentment for. But as we learn in this interview, Carlson and Colby are friends, and Colby has a book to sell, and those things are more important than the facade of Tucker's anti-imperialism. Much of this interview is Colby firing off talking points about the danger of China, and he doesn't make a terribly compelling case for his position. Tucker Carlson is very weird in this interview. Although the fear-mongering about China is on brand, his questioning constantly reverts to the talking points he usually has on his show. While Colby is more willing to give the typical answers you'd see from a Washington insider military hawk, Carlson keeps dredging up some of the bogus culture war narratives in response.
The greatest adversary was Russia under Vladimir Putin, and then Biden is elected, and the new Secretary of Defense tells us that the single greatest adversary is in fact within our borders, and it's white men. The U.S. military seems demoralized, and its leadership seems completely distracted by irrelevant concerns like white rage and transgenderism. That's the outsider's perspective.
Colby deflects a lot of these questions and comments, and his tactic seems to be to constantly compliment Tucker and his show.
And I applaud your focus on this issue. And any institution that is above accountability will fail. I mean, I think that's a point that you always stress, and I completely agree with it.
Overall, it's not a terribly interesting interview, though I was impressed that even in this dry discussion about American foreign policy, Tucker Carlson still made time to insert some conspiracy theories.
The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they did Corregidor, the Bataan Death March, they bayoneted nurses in Hong Kong, et cetera, and then we got really, really angry.
Well, that's why Roosevelt allowed it, right? He clearly did. But whatever.
Okay.
I don't want to relitigate the war.
I should stress that there is no evidence whatsoever that this is true. I've linked an article from NPR on the subject below if you want to read more about it. And he cranks up some real fear on China by asking what one of their nukes would do to an American city.
Modern nuclear weapons are more powerful. What kind of effect would a modern nuclear bomb have on an American population center?
Tucker Carlson claims to be an anti-interventionist and someone opposed to the American tendency to push itself into conflicts around the world in an effort to expand or maintain its hegemonic influence. But in this interview, he is reinforcing the very common talking point, something you see in both parties, about China being an existential threat and discussing the need for a potential military response. It speaks to the game Tucker Carlson is playing, claiming to be a populist speaking for Americans, specifically conservative ones, who have been ignored by the Republican establishment, and then turning around and inviting insiders like Colby on to have a friendly chat about the American military possibly being in an open conflict with China. He does the same thing on Tucker Carlson Tonight when, in the week I watched, he had on politicians including Senator Josh Hawley and Governor Ron DeSantis for friendly conversations. Tucker Carlson can pretend to be firmly against the neocons who sent the US into Iraq, but the figureheads from back then are gone, and Carlson is happy to play nice with their ideological successors. While the branding of populism may be popular, he'll happily cozy up to politicians he can convince his audience represent their interests, even when they clearly serve a wealthier class. It sure is helpful branding, though. The other episode of Tucker Carlson Today I watched was far more on brand. On October 20th, Tucker welcomed Professor Dorian Abbott to talk about how he had recently been cancelled by the woke mob. There is some backstory here. In 2020, Professor Abbott, a geophysicist at the University of Chicago, had some complaints about how diversity, equity, and inclusion groups were impacting the selection process for graduate student candidates and faculty hires. Like all reasonable academics, he voiced his concern via a YouTube video, since taken down, which was responded to by a letter signed by over 100 students, faculty, and alumni calling for the university to allow students to withdraw from his classes without penalty. Ultimately, the university president sided with Abbott, and he faced no administrative disciplinary measures. Of course, this was not why Abbott was brought onto Tucker Carlson's show. Most recently, Abbott co-wrote an article for Newsweek with Stanford Associate Professor Ivan Marinovich, once again voicing concern about the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion, proposing that someone's identity should have no impact for post-secondary admissions. One interesting aspect of this article is that Abbott briefly mentions that his proposal would also eliminate legacy admissions as well, which is the practice of a school, typically seen in elite Ivy League schools, giving students preference if they had a family member who attended the institution. While it's lovely to see this be mentioned, it seems strange that Abbott only mentions it in passing, and it comes off as a defense against people calling him racist. If anything, legacy admissions seem far more unfair, as it doesn't just help individuals from racial backgrounds that typically have privilege, but it goes that extra step of ensuring that someone from an already wealthy family gets special consideration for a spot at some of the best schools in the world, so it discriminates based on class as well. Had Abbott come out hard against legacy admissions rather than diversity admissions, we might be viewing him entirely different, but it was diversity that was his main target. In this article, Abbott makes no mention of the research that demonstrates how his field of geophysics is hostile towards faculty that aren't white men, such as himself, and that there are active biases against women and non-white racial groups, and that these diversity programs are designed to undercut that bias by breaking down the systems that prevent inclusion. He also seems unaware that greater diversity within groups creates more novel hypotheses and actually expand research potential, not limit it. Professor Abbott seems to be under the impression that science faculties are untouched by these biases and exist in realms of pure reason, where facts and evidence are all that matter, and a person's identity couldn't possibly impact their work. He seems unaware of the academic research that undermine this idea, which is strange because those studies that you saw flash on screen as I was talking about those topics were all included in the letter complaining about him in 2020. It's almost as if he either didn't read them or simply has no interest in acknowledging them. That aside, what probably drew the most attention in this article is this passage towards the end. 90 years ago, Germany had the best universities in the world. Then an ideological regime obsessed with race came to power and drove many of the best scholars out, gutting the faculties and leading to sustained decay that German universities never fully recovered from. We should view this as a warning of the consequences of viewing group membership as more important than merit, and correct our course before it is too late. If Professor Abbott is interested in starting a conversation about university admissions, I'm not sure comparing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs to the Nazis is a helpful talking point. Also, there's something truly grotesque about comparing an effort to help marginalized peoples have better access to higher education with the effort from Nazis to keep those groups out of universities. It seems more like the exact opposite of what's going on. Anyone can make grossly reductive points like this. I could say the Allies in World War II were just like the Nazis, because when they were at war, both militaries killed soldiers on the opposite side. But that would be a silly comparison that removes all nuance from the discussion. But maybe Tucker Carlson will bring this up in the interview. Except no, definitely not. We're going to get stuff like this instead.
I don't think I've ever seen a college professor lay out in such clear, and I will say gentle terms, as you did, what's at stake.
I'm not sure a Nazi comparison is all that gentle. The rest of the interview goes the way you might expect, with Tucker praising Abbott at every turn and some questionable responses being treated as a matter of fact. For example, Professor Abbott complains about certain ideologies.
I was uncomfortable with ideologies that discourage discourse, because when you can't speak with the other side, the only recourse is violence.
Yes.
And I saw that playing out in the summer of 2020.
This is a weird comment. Obviously, the summer of 2020 refers to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and in other contexts, it could be generously understood as violence in response to an indifferent state that doesn't care about the impact of harsh policing on Black communities and won't have that difficult conversation. But in the context of this interview with Tucker Carlson, it reads more like a condemnation of Black Lives Matter for not wanting to talk about their problems instead of resorting to violence. Putting aside the fact that the violence in BLM protest has been grossly overstated by the media, the only way someone can assume Black people don't want to talk about the violence inflicted upon them by the state is to deliberately ignore that conversation, which has been happening for a very long time and has been conveniently ignored by people such as Professor Abbott. It's a great example of how someone like Professor Abbott was completely ignorant of a problem until it boiled over into a mass movement. And even now, his response is that we need to think even less about the negative impact of the social construct of race. This is not the mindset of someone ready for a conversation, except when it's with Tucker Carlson in a softball interview. The interview muddles along, and I feel like I could spend a whole hour on how so many of these answers are wrapped up in gentle language, but reveal a deep ignorance of the many issues at play. But I want to once again mention how conspiracy theories rear their ugly head. Here's Professor Abbott talking about who's really behind all this diversity stuff.
But the problem is that there's a small group that's extremely committed you could call them the woke activists or the social justice activists. And they're willing to spend all their time on this stuff, and they sort of steamroll.
And there's some kind of Twitter mob that organized in this as well.
There's almost like a playbook to try to take someone down who disagrees with the ideology. So the first thing that happens is people go on Twitter and they organize and they write lots of messages about the person. And the messages say mean things. So they'll say, this is racist, bigoted, white supremacist, like very scary sounding things.
The idea that some people have genuine criticisms of him and are simply responding to his words doesn't seem to occur to him. He just waves it away as some kind of conspiracy to advance the Fourth Reich. This interview isn't strictly about the Newsweek article getting some criticism, though. Professor Abbott is a victim in all of this because he was about to deliver a guest lecture at MIT, but was disinvited because of the blowback of that article. Abbott's response is slightly telling in this interview.
Only the top people in the field are invited to do this. You give a large public lecture for like 500 people, and then you visit the department at MIT.
About your research?
About a outreach level of your research.
It sounds like this lecture was a big deal, but what is this outreach level comment? It turns out that this lecture at MIT was intended not strictly for faculty or university students, but also for high school students. Robert Vanderhilst, head of MIT's Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences Department, clarified in a statement. The Carlson lecture isn't a scientific talk for fellow scientists. It has a very specific format and public outreach component, seeking to build public understanding of climate science and to inspire and engage with area high school students. We felt that with the current distractions, we would not be in a position to hold an effective outreach event. I made this decision at my discretion after consulting with faculty and students in the department, and knowing that some might mistake it as an affront on academic freedom, a characterization I do not agree with. Though this particular lecture was cancelled, MIT did invite Professor Abbott to give another lecture, this one instead with faculty and university students. This isn't a case of someone being cancelled, it's a case of someone's lecture being rescheduled. But that's not the narrative we see on Tucker Carlson's show.
It's a way to cripple someone's scientific career and put pressure on them not to speak out.
I don't know how speaking to high school students would mean more for his career than presenting his research to practicing academics. But there's one more aspect of this interview that was very informative. After Abbott had that letter written about him in 2020, the minor controversy that followed drew the attention of many supposed free speech groups. Apparently, Abbott suddenly found himself networking with a number of different groups and individuals ready to champion his cause. That the worst thing that happened to him was a letter didn't matter. They welcomed him into their fold.
I was already a part of the Heterodox Academy. I got involved with FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. I met with some of the leadership at ACTA, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. I started networking and trying to understand what had happened and how I can be effective.
He unironically calls this a group of classical liberals and even mentions how they set up a little safe space for themselves.
They have controversial speakers, and it's only faculty who attend by invitation only. So everyone can trust who's there.
And as is typical with these conversations, we see Tucker Carlson and Professor Abbott pat themselves on the back for having a conversation, even though they might disagree on some stuff.
And you speaking to me is not the same as ratifying all of my different crazy opinions, which you may disagree with, but that's not the point.
If you didn't talk to everyone you disagreed with something on, you wouldn't talk to anyone.
Right.
It's like this program turned into an episode of The Rubin Report, where the hapless Dave Rubin happily nods along with whatever right-wing ghoul he's invited onto his show. Only in this case, it's a bit more sophisticated, with Tucker Carlson bringing on a sympathetic face to advance similar talking points, and he's actually capable of marching to the same beat alongside with them, instead of vacuously nodding his head like Dave Rubin. I hate how hollow the whole comment about how they can disagree about things but still talk to one another. At no point in this interview did the two of them have any sort of meaningful disagreement about anything. It's the same line Dave Rubin would have about not having to agree with all his guests. If there is no active airing of these disagreements, in this case Tucker Carlson doesn't even bring them up, then this is just platforming ideas with no pushback. The invisible disagreements don't matter because they're not talking about them. These are two people who agree about everything they're discussing in this interview. Their disagreements could be about fundamental policy issues or what kind of potato chip they like to eat. It doesn't matter. We don't see it. Professor Abbott not only faced the horror of having his MIT lecture rescheduled, he was also rewarded with an additional lecture at Princeton, which so far has over 10,000 viewers registered, which is a lot more than the 500 he expected at his first MIT lecture. The interview ends on an optimistic note that really reinforces the idea that this man has, in no meaningful way, been cancelled. that there is an entire apparatus ready to make him the next darling of the free speech crowd. He might make the rounds on exclusively right-wing shows, talking about the left being out of control, and if he plays his card right, maybe he'll get a job at the Blaze. Or maybe we'll never hear about this guy again, because, to be perfectly honest, guys like this have limited appeal. They're tools to talk about the phantom menace of cancel culture. It's really just the media-savvy ones who can parlay that into a career. I don't know if this guy has it in him for that. Remember when I said about how I got lucky that Tucker took Friday off? Well, that luck ran out when I learned that he also dropped an extra bit of content onto Fox Nation, one of his monthly Tucker Carlson originals. This one titled, Blown Away, The People versus Wind Power. As you might have guessed, it's about how wind power is a threat to America. This 25-minute special, which calls itself a documentary, is so thin and cheesy, I struggled to take it seriously. It's lavishly produced and leans very heavily on interviews that give emotional context to the supposed threat of wind power. That's the second type of interview I mentioned above. The vast majority of subjects are either regular people or activists upset that wind turbines have been or are being built near them. Here's an example.
People who look at some of these wind proposals figure out quickly that one of the reasons their community is being targeted is it's poor and they're perceived as being desperate for revenue.
This sure seems like a case of the little guy being trampled by big business. So let's see who we meet first.
The consequence of this affluent NIMBYism is that the high cost of green energy falls on poorer places like rural Iowa, home to Mike and Tanya Lamb.
I'm not sure what property values are like in Iowa, but there is no way that anyone living in that home is one of the poor and desperate described earlier. Tanya Lamb, who lives in the house, literally calls it her dream home.
It is our dream home.
The special is a collection of shots of windmills breaking up otherwise flat scenery. And if you're guessing many of these complaints about windmills is that they will ruin the view, you'd be right.
In 2019, the wind farms came.
This is our view from our dinner table. Turbines every direction.
And we get a lot of shadow flicker in here too.
I mean, just imagine being in a room and someone's turning the light switch on and off, on and off, on and off. I mean, and it's in the middle of the day. Well, it's actually in the morning is when it's the worst. And it almost makes you dizzy.
There are some other assorted complaints, like the wind turbine creates a lot of noise. And the only time we hear noise from a turbine is when we get one of these weird close-ups where audio is almost certainly being manipulated.
Our peaceful country living.
That isn't to say that these things are completely silent, and I suppose whatever noise might be generated is annoying. Anyone can find plenty of these complaints online, but a problem with this criticism is that it's couched in the idea that these wind turbines are in rural areas because people in cities don't want the burden that comes with building them. That is, supposedly, the noise they create. As someone who currently lives in a city, that is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. As I type this, I can hear a plane flying overhead as it approaches the city's airport. 30 minutes ago, there was a siren as an ambulance drove by, and a few days ago, I spent most of the day listening to a construction crew repair a water main down the street from me. We get noise in the city. The occasional whooshing noise would not be a big deal. The reason you don't see a lot of wind turbines in cities is because they're more effective in wide open spaces, such as coastal areas or open plains. If you live somewhere like a flat part of Iowa, that's what makes it an attractive spot for a wind turbine. Wind isn't nearly strong enough when a turbine is surrounded by buildings. We get some laughable complaints about how subsidies are used to create wind farms.
Wind farms only exist because they're heavily subsidized by politicians with your money. They wouldn't exist otherwise.
There's no mention at all of subsidies that go towards fossil fuel companies. This is where the special really drops the ball. Any discussion about energy needs would, of course, mention that there is always a cost associated with them, both financial and environmental. And while wind turbines have one, comparatively, their cost is lower than that of fossil fuels. An article in Nature describes the amount spent on fossil fuel subsidies as more than triple what is spent on renewables like wind energy. It's irresponsible to discuss these subsidies without presenting that context. But it certainly doesn't end there. What really annoyed me in the special is when it got personal, and Tucker tried to use the birds to push his agenda.
From the federal government and other studies that show that hundreds of thousands of birds are killed every year by wind turbines.
Again, a comparison needs to be made here. Every year, far more birds are killed by power lines, buildings, and cats than wind turbines. And if we're going to reduce this discussion to energy production, fossil fuels are driving climate change, which will, and does, have a dramatic impact on bird habitats, devastating populations, and threatening entire species with extinction. This isn't to say that we shouldn't consider birds when building windmills, particularly species that are more likely to be impacted by them. And this can be addressed by considering migration patterns and habitats when it comes to placing windmills. But climate change is by far the bigger threat, and if someone truly cares about the birds, fossil fuels are a much greater danger to birds than windmills. There is very little to comment on in this special. We spend some time with a fisherman worried about his business failing because of wind turbines that haven't been built yet, and activists who say that wind turbines would mean New York has changed its political composition.
This state, it's not a democracy, it's a socialist republic.
And while it might be fun to just dunk on these people, providing evidence that building windmills around water typically has no meaningful impact on fish populations, or when this guy holds up a map to demonstrate that New York State would never build wind turbines near New York City, is completely contradicted by the fact that there is the Empire Wind Project, an offshore wind farm being built right next to New York City that is planned for completion in 2026. Ultimately, this is the smallest of potatoes being presented. The previous Tucker Carlson original special to air was about UFOs. If you're in a series that includes a special about the dangers of UFOs, I hate to break it to you, but you're not on a serious program. And so we come to the end of our odyssey through the many programs of Tucker Carlson, and this was all from a single week. What I found most surprising about this venture was how diverse Tucker's talking points were. He truly had something for everyone. He had conspiracy theories of all flavors. He had racism. He had sexism, transphobia, anti-Semitism, neocon, republicanism, and religiosity. Part of my research included trips to the Facebook page for Tucker Carlson Tonight, where clips of the opening monologues were often shared, and the comments were completely uninteresting. Some, I guess I'll call them highlights, include, "If we the people want to keep our freedom, we must stand up and not submit to the mandates. We must push back. We must ask the one and only true God to have mercy on us and shine the light of truth on the evil being played out right in front of us." No wonder the left hates Tucker Carlson. He mops the floor with them every single night. With the exception of the Colin Powell monologue, which sparked a bit of debate between those who respect his position and those who hate his disapproval of Donald Trump, the comments are mostly filled with screeds against Democrats and adulation for Tucker. No one is watching the show critically. They're coming here to have their biases served. This observation, I imagine, will shock no one, nor will my debunking of Tucker Carlson's content. His program has long been understood as a pack of lies used to push far-right talking points, but by watching it for a week, what surprised me was how artificial it all felt, so obviously rehearsed. Here's a quick example.
Like white privilege, family privilege is an unacknowledged and unearned benefit instantiated, if that's even a word, these people are so stupid, instantiated in U.S. laws, policies, and practices. Just write like an American.
For the benefit of Tucker, according to Oxford, instantiated means to represent as or by an instance. It's the little examples like these that exemplify, or instantiate, the somewhat folksy attitude Tucker presents on his show, much like the rolled up sleeves and wood paneling on his Today program, or the photo ops he does in his definitely real and not at all staged cabin-esque room. Tucker Carlson's audience have bought into this fiction of him being a man of the people, even though he comes from a wealthy background and continues to make millions on Fox News, pushing hollow narratives designed to misinform and distract his audience from the fact that he, and people like him, are actively working against their interests. It speaks to the problem of personalities in political commentary. People aren't tuning in for the news, they're tuning in to see Tucker. He gives them a version of the world they want to believe in, so they outsource their thinking to him, and he shapes the news of the day into a version that confirms their biases. Whether it's distracting them with bogus stories about menacing refugee children or misinforming them about vaccines that will save their lives, the objective is to rile people up and make them angry with empty narratives and then direct them towards Republican politicians who will devote more money to the military and undermine projects that might benefit the American people. The interview with Rutger Bregman summed it up perfectly when he called Tucker Carlson a millionaire working for billionaires, and that is why that segment never saw the light of day on Tucker's show, and we only have evidence since Bregman recorded it himself. Tucker Carlson needs that facade to keep this whole thing going. It's not about standing up to the powerful elites. It's about distracting the people with nonsense so they don't notice those same elites exploiting them. That is what Tucker Carlson does with his programming each week. This one was quite a ride. Tucker Carlson's show really spins your head around, just constantly firing off information at you, daring you to even try and understand it. If I wanted to debunk every claim he made on his show, this video would have been like 5 or 6 hours. It's the eternal problem of debunking videos where the truth takes so much longer to explain than the lie that is repeated so easily. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, you can be like the lovely names going up your screen now and join my Patreon. You can also become a YouTube member. You will get early access to videos, download links to my theme songs, and of course your name in the credits. To support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell for notifications. Thank you all so much for watching.